Hello to all. Today we talk about Homer. No, not this. This. Hello everyone and welcome to my second lesson on my classic nuggets. On the theme of pestilence in ancient world. In the last lesson we talked about the etymology of the words virus and bacterium. Now we will see our cute microorganism in action. Plague is a widespread theme in literature. We'll see. And for the classics, it's been found since the beginning of the literature. Precisely in Homer's Iliad. Some clarification for those who know nothing about Homer. One, it's hard to believe that an author named Homer really existed. Two, the Homeric poems are the result of a collective gestation of myths that were told for centuries by the singers of tales. 3. One of these performances was put at a certain point in a written text. There are those who support a very ancient date, 8th century, those who think that this occurred during the tyranny of Pisistrate in the 5th century. 4. Homeric poems are 2, Iliad and Odyssey, each in 24 books. Please remember this number, it's important. 5. The Iliad does not speak about the Trojan War and about the Trojan horse. It's only about episode, the wrath of Achilles. And Achilles' anger has to do with plague. The Iliad begins, in fact, during the 10th year of the Achaean war against the Trojans. The Achaean camp is lashed by a terrible plague. What is its origin? Here the flashback starts. The Trojan priest, Chryses, had a daughter, Chryseis, captured and ended up a slave to the king of the Greeks, Agamemnon. The father, therefore, goes to Agamemnon to redeem her, offering a lot of gold and many precious objects. But Agamemnon refuses and says that Chryseis will stay with him, that he will take her with him to Argos, where she will grow old and will be used as a sexual slave. Let's read the passage in Greek with subtitles. Ενθαλoi, μεμπάντες, επεουφεμέσα να χάιρι. Αιδεστάι τη αιρέα, καϊάγλα δέξτα η απόινα. Alluk atreide Agamemnoni endanethymο, alla κακόσα φιέι, κρατερόν δεπιμήθωνετέλε, μέσε γερόν, κοηλές νεγό παρανέουσι κυχέιο, Enin delunon teistron autisiont, menu toi chraisme skeptron kai stemma seoio, dendego ulso, primin ke geras e peisine, e metero eni oiko, enargei, delosti padres, iston e poi comenen, kai emon lejos sentiosan. Anlici, meneretidze, saudero, oskeneai. At this point, Croesus leaves and begins to pray to his god, Apollo, who is the god not only of the arts, but also of the epidemic diseases, which the myth depicts as arrows thrown from the divine bow. And the plague lasts 9 days. Osefat Euchomenos, tu decrie, Phoebus Apollon, bete catolympoio, carenon homenoscer, toxomoisin echon ampherea te faretren, eclanxan daroistoi epomon homenoio, autucine tendos odeie, noctie oikos, edzete peita paneuteneon, metadioneke, deine te clanche, genetar greo bioio, ueas mem proton epoceto, caecuna sargus, autar, epeit autoisi belos, ecepeus esafies, ballaiei, de pyrae necion, caionto zameiai, ennemar, men, anastraton, oceto, che la theoio, tedacate degorende, calesa tolaon, Achilleus. After that, it's known history. Agamemnon, reproached by Achilles, finally agrees to return the girl to Croesus. But he wants Achilles' slave in return. Achilles is furious and the Iliad starts. But let's stick to the plague instead. You know that coronavirus is probably of animal origin. It went from the animals, perhaps a bat, maybe another animal, here not important, to man. This way, in Italian, is called the jump of species, but the correct English word is spillover. There's a book that has suddenly become famous in these days that deals with it. Homer speaks in images. Sometimes, to understand what he means, you need to abstract. He's saying that the plague comes from afar. It affects animals first. Then there is a spillover and it passes to humans and very quickly assumes epidemic proportions. Is this reminding you of something? Really, when we say that in classics there's everything, it's true. There's everything from the past, the present, and future. Another famous literary situation containing the plague is in the Oedipus King of Sophocles, represented in the 4030 BC, or maybe a few years later. Remember this date. This is the story. The city of Thebes is affected by the plague. There must be a curse, because, as you know, the plague is caused by the wrath of one god, Apollo, or another. The king of Thebes, Oedipus, tries to understand who has made angry the gods, and investigating, he discovers he himself is involuntarily guilty. But we'll talk about it in another lesson. You may have noticed that Homer's description is very short, dry, less than 10 verses. Also, Sophocles' account is very short. Why? is not very interesting for the tragedy. It was perhaps not worth the time. But in any case, the Athenian didn't need to be told how the plague worked, because they experimented by themselves. Exactly in 433 BC had been the year of the famous plague of Athens. For us, this plague is famous because it was told by the greatest Greek historian, Thucydides, who had been infected but had the good luck to recover. A few years later, he wrote his masterpiece, The Peloponnesian War, and in the second book of the Eight, he tells us how a plague comes to upset the normal habits of people. A bit like it's happening now to us these days. Only for us is a normal, peaceful life to be disrupted. At the time, it was the curse of the war. I would like to read it here in full, the chapters, not to interrupt the flow of the speech. I ask my students to take at the end the test of my model. It helps you remember things. We will talk about Thucydides next lesson. So, enjoy Thucydides and salvete omnes. First days of summer, the Lacedaemonians and their allies, with 2/3 of their forces as before, invaded Attica under the command of Archidamus, son of Zeuxidamus, king of Lacedaemon, and sat down and laid waste the country. Not many days after their arrival in Attica, the plague first began to show itself among the Athenians. It was said that it had broken out in many places previously in the neighborhood of Lemnos and elsewhere, but the pestilence of such extent and mortality was nowhere remembered. Neither were the physicians at first of any service, ignorant as they were of the proper way to treat it, but they died themselves the most sickly, as they visited the sick most often, nor did any human art succeed any better. Supplication in the temples, divinations, and so forth were found equally futile, till the overwhelming nature of the disaster at last put a stop to them altogether. It first began, it said, in the part of Ethiopia, above Egypt, and thence descended into Egypt and Libya and into most of the king's country. Suddenly falling upon Athens, it first attacked the population in Piraeus, which was the occasion of their saying that the Peloponnesian had poisoned the reservoir, there being as yet no wells there, and afterwards appeared in the upper city, when the death became much more frequent. All speculation as to its origin and its causes, if causes can be found adequate to produce so great a disturbance, I leave to other writers, whether lay or professionals. For myself, I shall simply set down as nature and explain the symptoms by which perhaps it may be recognized by the student, if it should ever break out again. This I can the better do, as I had the disease myself and watched its operation in the case of others. The tear, then, is admitted to have been otherwise unprecedentedly free from sickness. And such few cases as occurred all determined in this. As a rule, however, there was no ostensible cause, but people in good health were all of a sudden attacked by violent heats in the head, and redness and inflammation in the eyes, then inward parts, such as the throat or tongue, becoming bloody and emitting an unnatural and fetid breath. The symptoms were followed by sneezing and hoarseness, after which the pain soon reached the chest and produced a hard cough. When it fixed to the stomach, it upset it, and discharges bile of every kind named by physicians ensued, accompanied by very great disease. In most cases, also, an ineffectual retching followed, produced violent spasm, which in some cases ceased soon after, in others much later. Externally, the body was not very hot to the touch, nor pale in its appearance, but reddish, livid, and breaking out into small pustules and ulcers. But internally it burnt, so that the patient could not bear to have on him clothing, on linen, even on the very lightest description, or indeed to be otherwise than stark naked. What they would have liked best would have been to throw themselves into cold water, as indeed was done by some of the neglected sick, who plunged into rain tanks in their agonies of unquenchable thirst. Thus, it made no difference whether they drank a little or much. Besides this, the miserable feeling of not being able to rest or sleep never ceased to torment them. The body, meanwhile, didn't waste away so long as the distemper was at its height, but held out to a marvel against its ravages, so that when they succumbed, as in most cases, on the 7th or 8th day to the internal inflammation, they had still some strength in them. But if they passed the stage, and the disease descended further into the bowels, inducing a violent ulceration, there accompanied by severe diarrhea, this brought on a weakness which was generally fatal. For the disorder first settled in the head, ran its course from thence to the whole of the body, and even where it did not prove mortal, it still left its mark on the extremities, for it settled in the private parts, the fingers and the toes, and many escaped with the loss of these, some too with that of their eyes. Others again were seized with an entire loss of memory of their first recovery, and didn't know either themselves or their friends. But while the nature of the distemper was such as to buffer the description, and its attacks almost too grievous for human nature to endure. It was still in the following circumstance that its difference from all ordinary disorders was most clearly shown. All the birds and beasts that prey upon human bodies either abstained from touching them, till they were many lying unburied, or died after testing them. In proof of this, it was noticed that birds of this kind actually disappeared. They were not about the bodies, or indeed to be seen at all. But, of course, the effects which I have mentioned could best be studied in a domestic animal, like a dog. Such then, if we pass over the variety of particular cases, which were many and peculiar, were the general features of the distemper. Meanwhile, the town enjoyed an immunity from all the ordinary disorders. Or, if any case occurred, it ended in this. Some died in neglect, others in the midst of every attention. No remedy was found that could be used as a specific. For what did good in one case, did harm in another. Strong and weak constitutions proved equally incapable of resistance, all alike being swept away, although dieted with the utmost precautions. By far, the most terrible feature in the malady was the dejection which ensued when anyone felt himself sickening, for the despair into which they instantly fell took away their power of resistance and left them in a much easier prey to the disorder. Besides which, there was an awful spectacle of men dying like sheep, through having caught the infection on nursing each other. This caused the greatest mortality. On the one hand, if they were afraid to visit each other, they perished from neglect. Indeed, many houses were emptied of their inmates for want of a nurse. On the other, if they ventured to do so, death was the consequence. This was especially the case with such as made us pretension to goodness. Honor made them unsparing of themselves in their attendance to their friends' houses, when even the members of the family were at the last worn out by the moans of the dying and succumbed to the force of the disaster. Yet, it was with those who had recovered from disease that the sick and the dying found most compassion. These knew what taste was from experience, and had now no fear from themselves, for the same man was never attacked twice, never at least fatally. And such persons not only received the congratulations of others, but themselves also, in the elation of the moment, half entertained the vain hope that they were for the future safe from any disease whatsoever. An aggravation of the existing calamity was the influx from the country into the city, and this was especially felt by new arrivals, as there were no houses to receive them. They had to be lodged at the hot season of the year in stifly cabins, where the mortality raged without restraint. The bodies of dying men lay one upon another, and half-dead creatures reeled about the streets and gathered round all the fountains in their longing for water. The sacred places, also, in which they had quartered themselves were full of corpses, of persons that had died there, just as they were. For as the disaster passed all bounds, men, not knowing what was to become of them, became utterly careless of everything, whether sacred or profane. All the burial rites before in use were entirely upset, and they buried the bodies as best they could. Many, from want of the proper appliances, through so many of their friends having died, already had recourse to the most shameless sepultures. Sometimes, getting the start of those who had raised the pile, they threw their own dead body upon the stranger's pyre and ignited it. Sometimes they tossed the corpse, which they were carrying on top of another that was burning, and so went off. Nor was this the only form of extravagance which owed its origin to the plague. Men now coolly ventured on what they had formerly done in a corner, and not just as they pleased, seeing the rapid transition produced by persons in prosperity suddenly dying, and those who before had nothing succeeding to their property. So they resolved to spend quickly and enjoy themselves, regarding their lives and riches and the like things of a day. Perseverance in what men called honor was popular with none. It was so uncertain whether they would be spared to attain the object, but it was settled that present enjoyment and all that contributed to it was both honorable and useful. Fear of gods or law of man, there was none to restrain them. As for the first, they judged to be just the same, whether they worshipped them or not, as they saw all alike perishing. And for the last, no one expected to live to be brought to trial for his offences, but each felt that a far severer sentence had been already passed upon them all and hung even over their heads. And before this fell, it was only reasonable to enjoy life a little. Such was the nature of calamity, and heavily did in weight of the Athenians. Death raging within the city, and devastation without. Among other things which they remembered in their distress was very naturally the following verse, which the old man said had long ago been uttered. Exe doriakos polemos, kai loimos hamauto. So, a dispute arose as to whether dearth and not death had not been the word in the verse. But at the present juncture, it was of course decided in favor of the latter, for the people made their recollection fit with their suffering. I fancy, however, that if another Dorian war should ever afterwards come upon us, and a dearth should happen to accompany it, the verse will probably be read accordingly. The oracle, also, which had been given to the Lacedaemonians, was now remembered by those who knew of it. When the god was asked whether they should go to war, he answered that if they put their might into it, victory would be theirs, and that he would himself be with them. With this oracle, events were supposed to tally, for the plague broke out so soon as the Peloponnesians invaded Attica and never entering Peloponnese, not at least to an extent worth noticing, committed its worst ravages at Athens, and next to Athens, at the most populous of the other towns. Such was the history of the plague.